this ring in the back of my jewelry drawer for 6 years. I want to tell you about it. Never mention.
You open a drawer sometimes and find something you'd rather not look at too closely. A photograph, a ticket stub, a ring wrapped in a small cloth, pushed to the very back where your hand only finds it by accident. Everyone who noticed it over the years assumed the obvious thing, that it came from someone, that something ended and the ring was what was left over. Too painful to wear, too meaningful to throw away. That wasn't it, not even close. And the real reason took her almost as long to say out loud as it did to happen. I'll tell you what that reason actually was. But first, you should know where the ring came from in the first place. I'm Clara, and this is a closure session. Let's begin. Let's call her she. It doesn't matter what her name was. Everyone who noticed it. What matters is a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic, and the particular stillness of a building where everyone speaks a little quieter than they need to. Her grandmother had been sick for months by then. The kind of sick where every visit felt like it might be the one where something shifted for good. That particular Tuesday, her grandmother had been unusually alert, propped up against the pillows, working a ring off her own finger with fingers that had gone thin and papery over the past year. She remembers the room in specific. Small details, the way people often remember hospital rooms, the particular hum of the machine monitoring her grandmother's heart rate, a vase of slightly wilted flowers someone had brought a few days earlier, the thin blue blanket that never quite matched the rest of the room's decor. Her grandmother had always been sharp, even sick, even tired, and that Tuesday she'd been more like her old self than she'd been in weeks. Telling a story about a boy who tried to court her back in the 1960s, laughing at her own punchline before she'd even finished it. Take it, her grandmother said, before your mother decides who it belongs to. She'd laughed at the time, assuming it was one of her grandmother's dry jokes, the kind she'd made her whole life about family politics and who deserved what. She took the ring anyway, slid it onto her own finger, and sat with her grandmother for another 2 hours, talking about nothing important, the way you do when the important things are too large to say out loud. Her grandmother passed away 8 days later. The funeral is a blur in her memory now, the way funerals often are, a sequence of hugs and casseroles, and people saying the same handful of sentences in slightly different orders. What she remembers clearly, with a specificity that surprised her later, was in the parking lot afterward, standing beside her car with her mother, both of them still in black, both of them exhausted in the particular way grief exhausts a person. Her mother had noticed the ring almost immediately. That was Mom's ring, her mother said, not a question, a statement delivered with a particular weight behind it. She gave it to me, she said, the week before. She told me to take it. Her mother's face did something complicated, something that started as surprise and settled, slowly, into something closer to hurt. She never mentioned that to me. I didn't know she was going to, she said, and even as she said it, she could hear how inadequate it sounded, how much like an excuse rather than an explanation. Her mother didn't argue further, not there in the parking lot, not with everyone still filing out of the funeral home behind them. But something in her expression had already closed slightly, the way a door closes when someone decides, quietly, not to push it back open. The fight, when it actually came, happened almost 2 weeks later at her mother's kitchen table. Over a conversation that had started about something else entirely, dividing up furniture, deciding who would keep the old dining set, the practical, exhausting logistics that come after someone dies. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, her mother brought up the ring again. I just don't understand why she'd give it to you without saying anything to me, her mother said. I'm her daughter, you're her granddaughter. There's an order to these things, usually. I didn't ask for it, she said. She just gave it to me. I didn't know it was supposed to go through some kind of order. That's not what I'm saying. Her mother's voice had an edge to it now. The specific edge of someone who has been holding something in for 2 weeks and finally lets it out sideways, aimed slightly wrong. I'm saying I spent 40 years being her daughter, And somehow you get the one thing of hers that actually mattered, and I get told about it after the fact, in a parking lot, like an afterthought. She remembers her own voice rising to match her mother's, remembers saying something sharp back. Something about how her mother was making her grandmother's dying wish into a competition, something she regretted almost as soon as she said it, though not quite enough to take it back in the moment. Her mother had gone quiet after that, the specific quiet of someone deciding not to escalate further, but also deciding, somewhere underneath, not to fully let it go either. There was a moment right before the conversation ended where she almost apologized, almost said something softer, almost acknowledged that her mother's hurt made sense, even if the argument itself felt unfair. She didn't. She let the moment pass. Everyone who was a false step, telling her there would be another chance to say it later. Once things had cooled down, that chance didn't come for 6 years. The conversation ended with a resolution, the way arguments and grief often do. Both people too raw and too tired to actually repair anything, both retreating instead to their separate corners, with the argument still smoldering, unresolved between them. She took it off that night and didn't put it back on. You know what it's like to stop wearing something you were given out of love, because wearing it started to feel like a wound instead of a gift. That's what happened without either of them fully deciding it should. The ring, which should have been one of the last warm things her grandmother gave her, became instead a physical reminder of the ugliest conversation she'd ever had with her mother. She told herself at first that she'd start wearing it again once things settled down, once the funeral logistics were finished, once the estate was sorted. Once enough time had passed that touching the ring wouldn't immediately summon that kitchen table conversation back into her chest. But the real moment, the one I mentioned at the beginning, hadn't happened yet. Months passed, then a year. The relationship with her mother didn't fully rupture. They still spoke, still saw each other at holidays, still managed a kind of careful politeness that neither of them named directly as damage, but that both of them privately understood as exactly that. The subject of the ring became one of those things families learn to route around, the way you learn to avoid a specific pothole on a road you drive every day, without ever actually fixing the road itself. She moved the ring at some point from a jewelry box on her dresser to a drawer further back, not deciding to hide it exactly, just quietly making it a little harder to see every day. She told herself this was practical. Really, she was tired of the small flinch that happened every time she caught sight of it. 2 years after that, at a different holiday, a cousin who didn't know any better asked cheerfully, "Whatever happened to Grandma's ring? Did she still have it?" She remembers the brief, sharp silence that followed, the way her mother's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward her hand, checking, the way people check for evidence. She said yes. She still had it, and changed the subject as quickly as she could manage. There were other small moments, too, scattered across those years, that she only recognized as related to the ring in hindsight. Her mother declining, twice, to come to a family gathering at her house with excuses that seemed reasonable enough at the time, but that she later understood as a kind of quiet avoidance. A birthday card that arrived a week late, signed only with her mother's name instead of the warmer closing lines she used to write. None of it was dramatic, it was just a slow accumulation of small distances, each one easy to explain away individually, each one part of the same unspoken wound underneath. Do you know what it's like to watch two people you love, your mother, and the version of yourself that still wanted to be close to her, slowly drift into a kind of low-grade wariness around each other, all because of one object that came to represent so much more than itself? The ring stopped. The ring stopped being about her grandmother almost entirely. It became a small, quiet symbol of everything unresolved between her and her mother, a weight far heavier than a single piece of jewelry should ever have to carry. 6 years after the funeral, her mother was going through some of her own things, downsizing, the way people do, eventually, and came across an old letter tucked inside a book written by her grandmother years earlier. Apparently intended to be found eventually, though not necessarily this soon. The letter wasn't specifically about the ring. It was mostly about ordinary things, memories, small instructions, the kind of letter write to people so when they suspect they're running out of time and want to leave something behind. its logistics, but near the end, almost as an afterthought. Her grandmother had written a single that her mother read her to her over the phone, her voice tight with something that sounded like it had been building for 6 years. I'm giving the ring to her because she reminds me of myself at that age, stubborn and soft at the same time. I hope you understand, and I hope it doesn't cause any trouble between you two, because that would break my heart more than anything else I'm leaving behind. Her mother was quiet on the phone for a long moment after reading it. Then she said, in a voice that had lost most of its old edge, I think I turned this into something it was never supposed to be. This was the moment. The one from the beginning. Not the hospital room, not the parking lot, not even the kitchen table fight. This, a letter found 6 years too late, saying plainly the thing neither of them had let themselves hear clearly in all that time. That the gift never noticed it, that the gift had never been a slight against her mother. It had simply been an old woman trying to see something true about a granddaughter she recognized herself in, without ever imagining the small earthquake that single gesture would cause. Grief and resentment tangle together more easily than people expect. A loss becomes a competition, a small unspoken scorecard of who was loved more, who deserved more, who the person who died would have chosen first, if they'd been asked to choose at all. None of that was ever really about the ring. It was about two people, both grieving the same person, both terrified in their own way of discovering they'd mattered less than they hoped. Babe and she put the ring on again that night for the first time in 6 years. It fit exactly the way it always had. What had changed wasn't the ring. It was the 6 years of silence, sitting on top of it, finally quietly, starting to lift. Maybe you have your own version of that ring, not necessarily jewelry. Maybe it's a house, a piece of furniture, a photograph, something inherited that became tangled up in a family conflict that was never really about the object at all. Maybe you're still not speaking easily with a sibling or a parent over who got what, who deserved what, whose grief somehow taken more seriously. Do you know how often those fights are really about something underneath the object entirely? Not greed. Most of the time, usually just two grieving people, both quietly terrified that they mattered less to the person they lost than the other one did. Maybe you've also noticed how these conflicts tend to outlast their original cause. The object itself often stops mattering fairly quickly. What lingers is the wound of feeling overlooked or the guilt of having caused someone else to feel that way, and neither of those linger because of the object. Everyone who noticed it, they linger because nobody said the underlying thing out loud in time, the way her grandmother's letter finally did, 6 years too late to prevent the years of distance, but not too late to end them. I want you to hear something, and I want you to actually let it land, not just pass over you. An inheritance conflict rarely means what it feels like it means in the moment. It usually isn't a referendum on who was loved more. It's grief wearing an argument as a disguise, because grief itself often feels too enormous and shapeless to fight about directly, and an object is at least something you can hold and argue over and point to. You are allowed to still love someone even after a fight like that leaves a mark that doesn't fully fade. Family fractures over inheritance don't always heal cleanly, and that doesn't mean either person was fundamentally wrong to feel what they felt. Grief makes people do smaller, sharper versions of themselves for a while. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation. And sometimes an explanation is enough to soften something that anger alone never could. If there's an object in your life carrying more weight than it should, something inherited, something fought over, something that's become a symbol of a rift instead of a memory of the person you both lost, you're allowed to put it down or pick it back up in your own time. There's no correct schedule for when a ring or a house and who noticed it or a photograph is supposed to stop hurting to hold. And if there's a conversation you've been avoiding the way she avoided one with her mother for 6 years, it's worth asking yourself honestly whether the distance is protecting you from something, or simply prolonging something that both of you are quietly, separately still carrying. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight. Whatever you inherited that turned into a wound instead of a gift, you're allowed to let it become a gift again. Some things don't get resolved with one grand gesture. Sometimes it's just a small object put back on 6 years later, and a phone call that finally says the thing that should have been said from the beginning. Let it be quiet now. Let it be finished. Good night. I'm glad you were here tonight.